You're a monster. Thanks. Does this mean I get a raise? No. Just a medal. The budget isn't inexhaustible. Orson's got card, Ender's game. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski, host of My Life in Books. Red Széll is here also. He's actually on every 2 weeks. How's it going, Red?
Very well, thanks, Jacob. Yep, nice and warm over here in London, England. So the summer has arrived.
The entire northern hemisphere is just absolutely cooking up right now. I hope the southern hemisphere is doing a little better than us right now. But luckily, we're both indoors for the time being. No AC on my end. I don't know about you. I'm kind of dreading it though.
None at all, just a nice cool drink and the prospect of some holiday reading coming up as well. So.
Speaking of holiday reading, what we've been doing the past couple episodes that you've been on, we've kind of been like choosing a theme and then kind of elaborating on it and taking turns sharing books that kind of illustrate that theme that we definitely recommend because of how well it illustrates that theme. What are we doing today?
Right, okay, well this week, taking the holiday theme that little bit further, the author of the book that I will be discussing on Monday, later today actually, is Aaron Croyder, and he has written a book set in a Jewish sleepover camp in Canada's cabin country. The book's called Lake Burntshaw, and it's part coming-of-age novel, part romance, and part political investigation, looking at things like colonization and, who does own the land that these camps are built on. And it's a fascinating read. It's a good summer read. It's kind of young adult stroke adult book, as I say. But it got me thinking about books with group dynamics in them, where you get a group of people, usually strangers, being sent to a location that they don't particularly know very well and having to work through new situations together, and how sometimes that can be a bonding experience and how sometimes that can be a fracturing experience. And, it's very much a trope, particularly in kids' books. If you think of all the Enid Blyton, Mallory Towers books, or more recently, the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling, all these kids, all these disparate kids being thrown together in one school together and expected to work together. And all you have to do is look at the group dynamics that develop at Hogwarts between the four different houses to see how it can be constructive and very disruptive.
Yeah, they live quite apart, the four houses in Harry Potter, and it's like almost like by design. I always wonder why they separate them in houses in the first place. It seems like it's just begging for conflict. You're separating these kids and putting them into teams and making them explicitly compete. That's a terrible idea. But there's a lot of terrible ideas in Harry Potter. I don't know why you need a troll in the dungeon. That seems very dangerous and reckless. But the thing is, like, this whole theme of group dynamics, especially in places where you're away from home. Like these are, well, we're not talking about like home dynamics, but these group dynamics, especially when everybody is new to each other. They're interesting because they're very, it's something that we've all experienced. And school is the classic example. Like think of the student that goes to live in university in residence for the first time. And you start to know the people on your floor. And there's these group dynamics that can get incredibly complex, right? Where let's say you and the person next door, you get along really well, and your next door neighbor gets along with the person down the hall, but you and the person down the hall don't get along very well. And that's a complicated group dynamic with only 3 people, and it gets more and more complicated the more people there are. And I don't know about you, but I think we've all had experiences like this.
Oh, we have, absolutely. And, we all look to people who are similar to us in one way or another to find some common ground. And of course, when we do that, that can actually be quite exclusive to other people around us. Oh, well, they're just forming a gang and they're not inviting me in. And we also get split into different groups at school and university as far as the subjects that we're
Yes.
studying, or, whether you're in the first team for cricket or, the fourth team for rugby. And there's a very good line in this Aaron Croyder book, actually, that after you're split into groups, you start seeing the world as us and them. And I think that can be a great root of conflict between people. And obviously, where there's conflict or where there's friendship, that's where authors like to mine for their prose. And I think that's possibly why we get so many of these books about group dynamics.
And one of the ones that you wanted to bring up for this conversation was The Lord of the Flies, which is a fantastic example. Which, for the people who aren't familiar, it's after there's a plane crash. There's a bunch of kids that end up having to survive on their own on a deserted island, and they don't collaborate, and it just turns into uh, it's beyond anarchy. How would you describe what happens on the island?
Well, the kids do their level best to govern themselves, to set up a society, but very quickly, with no adults around, the differences between them start to show, and they start breaking into factions. And whilst there are some kids there who are come up with some great solutions. Piggy, the boy who's never named, but he's called Piggy because he's fat and he likes his food, and he's kind of a bit jowly, and he wears glasses, and yet he actually is probably the only reason they manage to eat, because he suggests that if they use his glasses to reflect the sun's rays onto something flammable, they can start a fire. And that means they can also signal to ships coming past. So you get to see that
Mm.
maybe the least likely people to come to the fore can be the most productive. Whereas some of the other characters who appear very alpha male actually start to create friction and fracture within the group and work against each other. And it's no spoiler to say that, their attempts to build a society end in division and chaos and death. And I think it's a heartbreaking book. I think all the more so because it was written by William Golding, who was a headmaster, and he saw that conflict and pride and anger are innate within human beings. He'd seen that through the Second World War. He'd seen what the Hitler Youth did in Nazi Germany. And he was pointing out that, from the age of small boys, there is that innate pride which will often end in violence. And actually, the name Lord of the Flies is a literal translation of Beelzebub, who was
Huh.
a biblical god of pride and warfare. And I think it symbolizes, that aspect of human nature.
And I mean, there's no wonder that Lord of the Flies is like classic curriculum reading for English classes across the Western world, uh, because of like such a vivid exploration of that theme. What would happen if you put a bunch of kids on an island, right? And there's something obviously children are very instinctual, right?
Mm.
They don't have the restraint that we do. So in a way, children are more human than we are. They're more representative of what we truly are at heart. And so it's kind of scary to portray that if you put a bunch of kids on an island, that they would become fractional. They would turn into factions and go against each other. Um, there is one book that I really appreciated for these like group dynamics. It's actually a series, a fantasy series called the Live Ship Traders series trilogy by by Robin Hobb, and in it, it takes place a lot on ships and these old wooden ships, right? And they have these tight-knit crews that they don't see shore for months at a time, and that's a great example of a group that's kind of put together and then they kind of have to
Mm.
make do.
Yeah.
Specifically, the characters that it follows are like the commanders. So there's like the captain, the second in command, and third in command. Um, and there's an understanding from the captain that you need to manage the group dynamics in a situation like this. And so there's this woman who's one of the POV characters who's very competent, very promising, but it's very unusual to have a woman be in a position of command on a ship like this. And so he decides to, instead of putting her second in command, to put her third in command, but then put a very, should I put it? Like a alpha male, very like a brutish man
Mm.
as second in command. Kind of like whip the men into shape, right? Because it's kind of unusual. Um, and that dynamic where everybody knows that the third in command is the competent, promising one, and that the second in command is going to specifically put there to be a brute, only makes him more brutish and ruthless in his methods.
Yeah.
And that dynamic was one of the most interesting things in my book to me. I'm simplifying it, but I absolutely love the Live Ship Trader series by Robin Hobb.
It's a new
Mhm.
one on me. I'll have to go
Mhm.
and look it up. But again, what
Mhm.
is more likely to start causing factions than a group of people who can all see the same truth staring them in the face that,
Yes.
yeah, that person has only been put there because the boss feels that we need whipping into shape. It, I I think there's no coincidence that a lot of books about camps and about group dynamics came out in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And
Huh.
we've talked before about Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which
Yes.
is
Mhm.
set on a US Air Force base on an Italian island. You know, group of young men from all over the United States, very different, different culturally, different religiously, different in their day-to-day aims, all pulled together for the one mission of defeating Germany. And how do you get these disparate people to work together? And there's another trilogy, funnily enough,
Mhm.
of books that I particularly like for that, because I like the guy's sense of humor. Evelyn Waugh wrote his Sword of Honor trilogy about his service in the Second World War. And the first book deals with his training in the army, which basically just involves being shipped around Britain and the mini crises that develop by, the country being bombed by the Germans and really, struggling to keep itself in the war. Then the second book's about his training to be a commando and being sent off. Again, he's living in an army camp, being sent off to live in another army camp on Crete. And the third book is about living on the run, basically, with the Yugoslavian partisans fighting the Nazis. And all three books just have these wonderful sets of characters thrown into the unexpected, thrown into company they never thought they'd keep. You can just imagine, you've got the English upper class having to hobnob with coal miners and people who sweep streets who they would not look twice upon, but how they all have to rely on each other so that they're not killed. And it's a fascinating dynamic, and Evelyn Waugh just does it with such humor because he frankly takes the piss out of everybody.
Red, you must have had friends when you were younger that acted significantly different from when they were at home and when they were at school. And there's a reason for that. It's because being in fresh environments presents everybody the opportunity to change their mirrors, to kind
Yeah.
of like change themselves. And while it might not be like an intentional thing, like, oh, I can recreate myself now that I'm going to school. Um, I think it happens naturally because the expectations that are put on you at home are not the same that they are at school. They're not the same that it might be at home, that they might be on a military camp on the island of Crete, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, another great quote from this Aaron Kreider book is, this camp is ancient. it's a place for you to be new. And that's it. Yes,
Mm.
you know, whoever my mum and dad thought I was at home, whoever they wanted me to behave like when I was at home, when I went to school, I was just Red Sail and I could pretend to be anything. Now, obviously, you don't pretend too much because you might invite friends home and they might come back and say, you don't live in a castle, you don't have alligators in the moat or whatever. But, and we, we didn't have a moat or alligators, but you can project the kind of person you want to be. However, I think again it comes back to what we were saying earlier. When you are doing that, you're also looking to join groups and make friends. So you might be pretending to be something you're not.
Exactly. And then you have to question which version of me is real. You might get
Uh,
into situations where, like, I don't like who I am at home and I don't like who I am at school. I don't like who I am at home and I don't like who I am on this military camp in Crete. I
yeah.
think about, I don't know if you read the Song of Ice and Fire series or watched the Game of Thrones television
No, I
series.
haven't. No, no.
Um, Jon Snow, one of the main characters, essentially kind of forcefully has to defect to the wildlings, which is like these wild people up in the north, and they live completely different lives. And one of the biggest conflicts in his storyline is like, who am I? Am I a
Mm,
free folk with the wildlings, or do I still belong to the Seven Kingdoms? And he has loyalties to both. And what was it? There's a quote by George R. R. Martin, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire series, where he says, "The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself." And
yeah,
it's a beautiful embodiment of that.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
mm,
No, and I think you
mm,
get elements of that in The Secret History by Donna Tartt, where the
mm,
narrator Richard is reflecting on his time at liberal arts college university in the United States, I think called
mm.
the Hamptons in Vermont, very sort of upper end Ivy League sort of liberal arts college, and how he goes, it's like as an outsider, and how he is accepted into this very privileged, very glossy, alluring group of people studying classics underneath a very charismatic professor, and how he's drawn into, well, actually, a very dark story, a very dark way of life that culminates in the death of one of those students.
Whoa.
And it's a brilliant book. It's difficult to
Mm,
talk about it without giving spoilers, but there is a man who is seduced by the glitz and the glamour of the alpha crowd at university, and who is an outsider and is going against type, and it is only he who can reflect on the events leading up to Bunny Corcoran, I think is the name of the student who dies on Bunny Corcoran's death. If you haven't read it's Donna Tartt's first novel. It's an absolute cracker. That's The Secret History. It's a superb detective story in reverse.
I remember reading a study somewhere. I forgot where it was. But it was saying that when it comes to organizational structures, humans organize best with groups that are 80 and below. After
Yeah.
that, there comes to be just impossible to there's comes to be issues that are just impossible to fix, and you end up with like too many layers of separation that it makes the organization almost like impossible to steer as a
Mm.
cohesive unit. And that tells me that humans in groups are almost like guaranteed to have conflict because of these
Yeah.
dynamics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we said, we select ourselves into teams. Um, uh, Carrying on the theme of books and camps, I as a boy, I read The Colditz Story by Major Pat Reed, all about the Allied prisoners who were kept in
Mm,
Colditz Castle, the most high security castle for the for the prisoners who'd escaped from other places. Now, Pat Reed
mm,
was every inch the English officer. So, reading his books, you'd have been excused to think that the majority of the prisoners there were British and that it was all daring do and that they were, doing the most audacious escapes. He does point out, obviously, that there were other nationalities there, and I think the first man to escape was a Frenchman. But it's told in a kind of partisan sort of competition way, almost
mm.
like the Football League tables. Well, England 3, France 1, and the Poles, well, they managed to get somebody out. And it's fascinating. But yes, the prisoners did organize themselves into national groups. And that really, really comes out in a later examination of the Colditz story called Prisoners of the Castle by Ben Macintyre, who's a brilliant
Mm.
military historian and who talks about this book in the November 2022 episode of My Life in Books for anybody who wants to leaf through the back catalogue. And he's fascinating because he takes all the different nationalities, including the German guards, and shows how Colditz was just this amalgam of hundreds of very disparate people, all of whom actually more or less managed to run a successful society despite one lot being in charge of the other, and
Huh.
how there's give and take on virtually all sides. Yes, you've got your martinets, you've got people who just believe that they're better than everybody else. But generally, actually, the Germans and the British and the French and the Poles and the Dutch, they all had to work in tandem. Otherwise, it would have been anarchy. And I'm not talking about collusion. I'm just talking about, the day to day, the limits of day to day behavior, how the prisoners didn't rag the guards too much because that wouldn't be good for the general morale of the camp. It's a fascinating story about human nature. And I don't know where we put limits on our personal whims and freedoms for the better of the group, the community, the society.
You know, you know what this is reminding me of? Um, it's very normal for humans to, especially when they're in groups, to be much more cohesive when there's a driving force
Mm.
forcing them to have a common purpose, or a common enemy is
Yeah, yeah.
such a powerful uniting force, something that's existential. And it reminds me, as a Canadian, when Trump in early 2025 started talking about making Canada the 51st state. Before he was saying those things, Canada was extremely divided, and there was like absolutely no patriotism or
Mm, mm.
Canadian pride. Him saying that completely changed everything. It
Yeah.
flips Canadian politics on its head and just shows that like having everybody agree on something goes to such a large extent to unite everyone and to make everybody like understand each other. Like we have this in common. We don't need to be fighting all the time. And I've seen this in books quite a bit too. And like these group dynamics that while they would be absolute a chaotic group, they work because there's a driving purpose like pushing them forward. For example, in The Women by Kristin Hanna, which is a book that came out, I think it was in 2024, but it follows the nurses, the women nurses that went to work in Vietnam during the
Ah,
Vietnam War. And there was this interesting dynamic where it didn't really matter if you were a general, a private, a soldier, a lieutenant, or just a nurse. Everybody was kind of equal because they were in the middle of absolutely horrible war zone, this thick jungle that's seen tons of combat. And when you're in combat, everyone's just a human with flesh and bones.
Yeah,
And it's like a
absolutely.
rank almost doesn't matter, and everybody's all together. But it's because there's this driving purpose bringing everybody together. Let's just survive and do our job here.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is exactly how they start off in Lord of the Flies,
Yes.
and
Mhm.
and then ego starts to get in the way,
Oh my
and
god.
I suppose at some point you do need an authority figure with whom the buck stops. But as you say, in the trenches with muck and bullets flying around your ears, then yes, it doesn't matter how many pips you've got on your epaulette, does
And then
it?
that begs the question, like, do humans need leader figures? Do we need leadership to work as groups? Like, is there a world where we can collectively come together on decisions? Essentially, does communism work?
Well, not without God, I think. I think at the end of the day, people need to believe that there's a higher authority somewhere along the
Yes.
lines. But, yes, it's an interesting conundrum, probably one for another episode.
If there are any aspiring writers listening to this right now, just keep in mind that the dynamics within groups is so much more interesting than dynamics between two people.
Ah,
Um, because the dynamics between two people is almost always affected by external factors. And it's understanding that that'll make you write much more realistic relationships.
yep.
Um, I in the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, one of the best parts of that book is the character work, but people always reference the relationship work
Mm,
between Ciri, Yennefer, and Geralt because they don't have it's like a found family thing
mm.
going on there, but the story would not work if it wasn't for the three of them. It's not about a bunch of bilateral relationships. It's multilateral between the three of them.
Absolutely, and I haven't really
Mhm,
had time to talk about it, but,
mhm,
the world's
mhm,
best-selling mystery story of all time, Agatha Christie's And Then There
mhm.
Were None. The ultimate group dynamic,
Yes.
and,
Great example.
I'm sure many people will know the story, but yeah, 10 people on an island, none of them knows each other, none of them knows why they've been summoned there. They've all been told they're all told that they are responsible for a murder, and one by one they perish. And it's a fantastic story, but it is all to do with that group dynamic. It's all to do with strangers having to work together before, well, attrition takes the last one of them.
Awesome premise, awesome execution. That's And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. And that was Red Sail. Thank you so much for your time, man. We'll have you on again in 2 weeks.
And then there was no time, Jacob. Okay, lovely to talk to
Yes,
you.
and there was no more time. Have a good one, eh? That was Red Sail. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. It's also available as a podcast. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of AMI Audiobook Review. The show airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. But we're also on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can send us your feedback via email at audiobookrareview@ami.ca. That's audiobookrareview@ami.ca. And follow us on Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. That's at AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Shymanski. Have a good one.